You're listening to Exploring Sustainable Values with your host Norman Chella on ASEAN Speaks by Maybank. In the previous episode, we looked at sustainability from the public's point of view, all through the lens of Islamic finance and how it empowers our surroundings. This is but one of many examples of showcasing great sustainable values. At the forefront of this is the leader, one tasked with many responsibilities, both in their organization and as an example of doing good work with great values. Let's take a look at that in greater detail. What role do leaders play in leading based on shared values? To what extent do they face the challenges of leading an organization from these values? How do we balance between expressing said values and compensation, financial or otherwise? What do you need to be to become an effective leader in this space? Instead of focusing on technical skills, let's take a look at the humane side of things. What defines a leader? How are they held accountable? And in the world of social responsibility, sustainability, and shared values, how can they do good while doing well?
My background in Islamic finance goes beyond that to my time at HSBC Amana, where I was head of strategy for HSBC's global Islamic finance.
This is Dr. Aamir Rehman. He is the chair of Indeed Capital Partners, which is an investment vehicle investing in businesses that help people align their finances and their behavior with their values.
I've also done some writing and research around Islamic finance and its impact, its role, and its prospects. I also have the great pleasure of serving on the board of directors of INCF, the Malaysian university focused on Islamic finance.
He is a shareholder in a number of fintech companies, largely in the Islamic fintech space, and a co-founder of the Fajr Capital Group, which is a private equity firm investing in the GCC and the ASEAN regions.
So all organizations have values, and the leaders have a particularly central role in demonstrating and living by the values of the organization. I think it's very important to underscore that every organization does have values, whether they're explicit about them or implicit.
The role of a leader is based on their relationship with their company values. Well, what if the leader doesn't uphold this?
So let's imagine, for instance, an organization never holds performance reviews or never actually completes them or does them at the very last minute in a perfunctory way. What that organization is signaling is that the staff development is not a priority.
Everyone has a role to play in creating a socially responsible work environment. And that means treating people good, treating them well, and treating them right. That is a challenge, both for employees and leaders in an organization.
The essential thing to keep in mind is that leaders have an outsized influence on shaping the values of an organization. And whatever they do, particularly how they spend their time, what they choose to speak about, that shapes the values of the entity, of the business. And of course, everyone has a role to play. So there is certainly, as I said, an outsized responsibility of the leader to ensure the values are known and lived. However, everyone in the organization has a role to play in recognizing them, articulating them, speaking about them.
The greatest leaders are known as great communicators. Martin Luther King Jr. with his "I Have a Dream" speech. Barack Obama with his amazing presence on stage. Closer to home, the influential Merdeka speech still rings in the ears of our people today. As a leader, with the ability to articulate your message well, you will become a great example for the people around you. As you uphold your values and really walk the talk, people will naturally follow in your footsteps.
Is if you go into an organization and you ask people what the values are of that business, you will invariably get different answers from different people. And sometimes there's a lot of overlap and sometimes there's divergence. And so that is a sign that not everyone is perceiving the priorities the same way. So a goal for a values-based organization would be that not only do they have values, but the leaders articulate them, live by them, and everyone in the staff, from the most junior to the most senior, would have a consistent understanding of what their enterprise stands for.
Every member of an organization plays a key role. Imagine bees in a hive. As they buzz about their daily routine, all bees have their duty to ensure the hive stays healthy. What is good for the hive then, in this case the team, is always good for the individual, whether recognized or not. This is the underlying foundation of a shared values-based system. Everyone in the organization knows the good work they do is for the benefit of it, and that will do the same for them in return.
So one scenario is that you have organizations that are created with a values orientation and an ESG mindset from the get-go. As those companies scale, the challenges are maintaining those values of ESG orientation or social impact orientation while also hiring new people. And there's often an investor component as well, that you raise capital from shareholders that may or may not share those same priorities when it comes to organizational values. So for an organization that begins on a value orientation, that group, as they scale, their struggle is to maintain it and to bring on all kinds of stakeholders, whether they be customers, employees, and of course, shareholders who share that orientation.
Not only does the leader have the responsibility to maintain that decorum with their team members, they also have to speak with investors, shareholders, and people who have a stake in the business. Organizations have to take into consideration all of the moving parts to do anything.
So one example that I can give in that area is Chobani. Its founder is very values-oriented, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, creating opportunity for underprivileged, disenfranchised communities. And so that is an example of, as it's scaled and taken on institutional capital, it needs to maintain its brand values and live up to them. So that's one set of challenges, which is if you begin with a values orientation, how do you maintain that over time? Another example, and this is where Bain Double Impact comes in, and many other businesses can be cited, is when you have a conventional organization that then begins to launch values-based or ESG-based proposition.
Bain Capital did not start with these principles in mind, but shifting in priorities and pushing for value-based impact made them think otherwise. The Bain Capital Double Impact Fund was created as a result, an ESG business unit under the Bain Capital umbrella. They're now focusing on scaling mission-driven companies and creating meaningful social impact at scale.
That's where the beginning tends to be very promising, exciting, and refreshing for the organization, because you have a group that is now focused on a particular set of values. It is pursuing an ESG strategy, which is very motivating for staff who work in it and also for external stakeholders, in this case, investors who are supporting the fund. The challenges of scaling are, as those enterprises become more successful, meaning the ESG component becomes bigger and bigger, then there's a decision point for the firm. Do we now try to embrace those values as being universal in our organization? And therefore, do we now want to take that impact experiment and apply it firm-wide? Or do we continue to have it as a separate business unit or a separate fund or a separate vehicle? And either choice
Remember,
that the organization
these
makes
are
has its
living,
benefits and
growing
drawbacks.
examples of implementing these principles. You don't have to do an overhaul of your organization to start. You can begin small, experiment small, and then make your decisions there. The challenge is navigating these models without compromising your values and the livelihood of your employees.
One challenge of keeping the social impact side as its own separate business unit would be that as it grows, and certainly as we're seeing trends that stakeholders are more and more interested in social impact, you want to create an environment where nobody in the organization feels like their work is inconsistent with their values or their work is less noble in its aims. So you want to make sure that everybody in the firm feels like they're contributing to the social mission. And, ironically, that can get harder as your social impact side gets bigger and bigger because the folks who are not part of that team will very likely want to be part of it. And the organization often benefit from taking those values and making them universal rather than keeping them in a particular business unit. If you are a conventional organization and you want to experiment with sustainability, how do you start? So what we want to make sure is that there are safe ways to experiment. We want to make sure that there is an openness and an acceptance of doing that. The challenges that I was referring to earlier really arise when you scale up and now you have to think about taking those lessons and applying them firm-wide. So the vision when you launch a values-based or ESG proposition, in my opinion, should be not that it will always be a standalone separate division, but rather that it will be a testing ground to see where there is a commercially viable values-based proposition, and then allow you to export those values or take those values and apply them across the enterprise. So that to me is the best way to experiment with a socially responsible or ESG strategy while also recognizing that the values therein have applicability to the business as a whole.
There's another word we should introduce here: compromise. What can we do to push for a values-based initiative or shift without compromising too much of our business?
Values is a very good term. And you talked about the term compromise. The term value is always relative. So it means that something A is worth more than B, B is worth more than C, so on and so forth. For example, when you have a green fund that says zero carbon emissions are its requirement, what they're saying is that having zero carbon emissions is more valuable to us than pursuing an additional $1 million of revenue if it's an operating company, so on and so forth. So that is a statement of prioritization. So when you say compromise, it is exactly a set of prioritization which values give us. Every organization does have values. It's just a question of whether we recognize them.
Here's a quick exercise for you. Can you recite the values of your company? And in reciting those values, checking back on the work that you did over the course of the past week, month, or year, have your actions reflected those same values you recited? This is a great chance to introduce something new into our thinking: the 7S framework. The 7S framework is one developed by McKinsey and helps with examining different parts of your organization and whether they mesh well together. As in the name, there are 7 aspects to address: strategy, how your organization plans to build and maintain competitive advantage; structure, how your organization is organized, whether number of team members, departments, communication lines, and more; systems, daily activities and procedures to get the job done; style, which is really leadership style; staff, on employees and their general abilities; skills, the actual skills, whether specialized or not, of your organization's employees; and shared values, which are the core values of the organization and overall work ethic. It's a great way to get an overview of your business.
This is a framework that we've had for decades in the world of organization, and it is a map. It really demonstrates what all of the aspects are when we talk about quote unquote organization. What are the areas we need to think about? Now, the center of that is shared values. And it really is profound to think that we've had this framework around for so long, and it has been calling towards this idea that shared values are at the center. So of course, the shared values are where we have the greatest need or the most important for sustainability, because there is no reason to assume or expect that everyone in an organization will want to sign up to the sustainability agenda, especially if it's a new initiative of the company. So we need to have open, candid, and inclusive discussions about what values matter, especially when an organization is now becoming more intentional about its values, that's the central piece, is to say, well, what is important to us? Now, one of these 7S's is systems. And so systems are very important for protecting the values of the organization.
Staying true to the values we advocate for in an organization also includes nourishing our employees, check-ins for well-being, support for mental health, and really looking out for one another. That, more than anything else, protects everyone.
So systems to me are a very, very important part that I would include in there. And again, all of the 7S's are important, but I would start with the shared values. I would then talk about the systems. And then the one, of course, where the values are really conveyed and what the theme is of our discussion today is staff being people, leaders, and all the colleagues in the organization. And that really follows quite nicely from the shared values and the systems, especially as an organization gets bigger, meaning when you have a certain set of values and you have a certain set of systems that support those values, you will attract talent that is consistent with your point of view in the world, that is consistent with your values. And so it becomes very nicely reinforcing. And so, yes, I would invite you and all of our listeners to consult the 7S strategy from McKinsey and look at all of the aspects and how they touch the areas of an organization, whether that be a sustainable organization, an innovative organization, an inclusive organization. We can use those elements to think about how to make them more consistent. Human beings and human behavior is amazingly malleable. The same people put in different environments will behave differently. So you're absolutely right. The human elements are the essence of the organization, and the norms of the space in which they operate will affect their behavior in ways that are very profound and often not even noticed. A person may not even notice that he or she acts differently in different settings, but that's very much the case if you observe them. And so a healthy organization creates boundaries and norms that are healthy, such that when people come into them, they are naturally driven to exhibit the very best behavior. And that is a sign of a healthy firm.
In a healthy environment, people want to do more. We want to do good because it fulfills us. Goodwill, then, becomes a topic of interest in the realm of sustainability. Expressing our values is one thing, acting on them is another. In Maybank Islamic's Global Connect Forum, Dr. Aamir shared a heartwarming story of a scholar in the audience of a keynote he gave 20 years ago, who secretly contributed to and supported the works of another in the same audience. None of that was done in public and was behind closed doors. It speaks to the desire to do good, especially from a leader's standpoint. How can we get more of this?
Storytelling is very important. So it's important that when we see someone doing something noble and laudable, we comment on it and speak about that. So that's a way in which we celebrate and note our values. So when we see things in our organization that we want to reinforce, we should highlight them, make them known. That's one. Second, what I would say is that when we have leaders who are exhibiting behavior that's contrary to the values that we're trying to foster in an organization, that has to be identified very, very quickly. And it needs to be addressed by those who are more senior than that person in question. So there needs to be both the positive reinforcement and also the correction of any behavior that's out of norm, particularly from people who are in leadership roles. Right, so it's about what behavior was exhibited and how that was inconsistent with the norms of the organization. And then there needs to be quick action by which leaders say, I was told that such and such happened. Can you tell me more about it? And there sometimes can be a misunderstanding of what actually took place, or there are circumstances that are not known by all the parties. But once it's ascertained that there was some breach of values, there needs to be enforcement. And if we do that, then we can have the kinds of cultures that we talked about.
This is when accountability comes into play. It requires a level of maturity, humility, and professional understanding of the context for a leader to provide and receive that kind of feedback.
A key message is that the implicit values or the non-publicized values are really the essence of what a culture or what an organization stands for. So yes, of course, we do need to have the value statements on the wall, and we need to have that we can be something we can point to and everyone shares. However, it's those hallway conversations, it's that helping a colleague out after they're in need, or covering for someone who's ill, and things like that, where you really see the values in action. So that's where the anecdotes, I think, are particularly important, so that we amplify them and that we know, we signal to our colleagues that we appreciate and we notice when there's good behavior.
The regular celebration of these acts of goodwill are great examples, both for ourselves and other employees. We're living these values. They aren't just plastered on the wall, but rather embodied. So, what about rewards and compensation?
It's often misunderstood how compensation motivates behavior. And for different people, it's at different stages of priority for them. If you have managers who are very effective in generating P&L, but culturally toxic, then the organization has to choose, even if that means some sacrifice of P&L. So that can be a very concrete discussion or difficult situation to be in. Very few people would want to be in an environment where they face toxicity in exchange for a slightly higher compensation. So there's that balance there. And certainly the intangible benefits of being part of a mission-driven organization are very, very valuable to professionals, and especially to millennials. We're seeing consistently valuing sustainability, valuing ESG, valuing mission-driven organizations. So I think that that's a very healthy and good sign. So we should recognize that financial compensation has a role to play, but also building a community that's mission-driven is a way to reward employees and retain them.
Millennials are but one subset of employees, workers, and individuals in general who prioritize certain things in life. What those things are can be split into three categories: what is sacred, what is negotiable, and what is indifferent. It's a framework.
So the premise of it is that not everyone is going to have the same factors or criteria at each of these circles to apply when they're thinking about that framework. So where we begin thinking about this is recognizing that everyone will be different in their approach. So let's start with the sacred. If you see this violated, or if this is something you simply cannot tolerate, for many people, religious accommodation would be in the sacred bucket. So for instance, if one is a Muslim and they need to pray their Friday prayers in congregation, and there's a workplace that says, look, we will not allow for that because, we need to prioritize our work on Friday afternoons, that could be sacred for that individual. And she or he could say, look, this place is not a right fit for me because I cannot attend my prayers. That could be a sacred thing for them. So that's a very tactical, specific example of something that could be sacred. So we need to recognize that for certain individuals, various factors will be sacred. So if you're doing that framework for yourself, what I would ask is, what is it that I cannot tolerate being compromised? And that goes in my sacred bucket. So you start with that. It can be inspired by faith. It can be inspired by ESG concerns like gender, environmental concerns, labor, fairness, etc. So for you to think through that is important.
Important to note that these are deal breakers. For myself, as an example, I want to see visible impact in the work that I do. For you, it can be completely different.
The next, in terms of what's negotiable, so this is where you'll have a theme or an issue, if I can call it that, but then have some flexibility regarding the threshold of that. So maybe, for instance, let's say you're in academia, and one of the criteria for advancement is publications. So you may or may not feel that publications are the best measure of a scholar, but maybe you're willing to negotiate on that and say, yes, I do recognize that in academia, even though I might prefer the teaching part, but I do recognize that, yes, I'm going to have to publish something. So I am, willing to negotiate on that as a requirement. And yes, I'll slog and write some papers where maybe I otherwise would not want to. But for me, that's negotiable. So I appreciate that the thought leadership is one of the criteria. And although my personal view might be that it's not so important to publish, I will accept that and publish in order to advance in this organization.
For some, this could be pay. For others, this could be workload. It is something you pay attention to. But you are weighing the pros and cons of having more or less of these negotiable points.
And then the indifferent bucket is where you are, open to what the organization wants to do, and you're flexible in terms of the format of how they pursue that. So, for instance, keeping with that example of professional development, then you might say, what's sacred to me is that there needs to be a process. What I'm indifferent to is, or what's negotiable to me is what the various pieces are. And for instance, in this example, how much they want me to publish. And what I'm indifferent to is whether the review process is quarterly or project-based or annual. Maybe that for me, that's not so important. So I am willing to accept what the organization proposes. I don't have a strong preference one way or the other. Whereas you might have another person coming into that role who says, look, for me, I feel like being evaluated every quarter is not fair to me. I feel that I'm under a microscope. So therefore, for me, that's not something I'm willing to negotiate. Maybe it goes all the way to the sacred bucket for that person. So that's an example. You would apply this, and you would very much want to begin as a professional, drawing your circles, thinking about what's sacred, then your next things about what's negotiable, and then by definition, everything else falls into the indifferent bucket.
Here's one thing to think about. Are these buckets or categories something you decide from the beginning, or is it more emergent?
Very much emergent. So what I would expect to see is that the issues that matter to people may stay the same throughout their careers, but their thresholds for what is negotiable and what is not will change over time. A clear example would be time to be with family, which maybe earlier in a person's career, certainly in my own career, in my 20s and early 30s, I did not need as much time with family in the sense that my parents, were well and they were in, the prime of their lives. I was married but did not have children, so I needed to spend time with my spouse, but not the same way that one needs to spend with their children. As life circumstances evolve, and you have children who really rely on being with their parents in order to develop them, shape them, and attach with them, then of course your thresholds will change for what you need by way of family time. And that's absolutely normal and natural.
It's reassuring to hear this, because you don't need to figure this out from the start. Everybody always needed time with family. But the question is, how much do you need it at this stage of your life?
I was recently at an event and I heard John Doerr, one of the founders of Kleiner Perkins and still chairman at Kleiner Perkins, speaking about environmentalism. And he has a book on the topic where he's applying all of the VC frameworks about speed and scale to the environmental crisis. And clearly this is something that he has come to later in life. It's not something that was important to him or he was even aware of, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And that's a beautiful thing. So we need to create that space for people to be able to change their values, to have new values, and to commit to new causes. Sometimes can be very counterproductive to say, well, Aamir, why are you making an issue out of environmentalism where 10 years ago you didn't? Or 15 years ago, you never talked about this. Why are you bringing it up now? Well, people grow. Issues become more pressing, and we should welcome that. And we should allow people to grow into ever better, ever increasing values and ever more attention to sustainability. So we should allow them to bring to the workplace concerns that maybe were either new to them or they newly feel comfortable voicing.
As leaders shift priorities and start to pay attention to altruistic, life-changing causes, we see this in their actions. They embody these shifts, and as they hold them, keep them as values. They give themselves permission to welcome the space to change, and that is a beautiful process.
One of the things I do is I teach at Columbia University. So I'm on the adjunct faculty there, and I teach a class on private equity. And many of my students are in their 30s. And they may come in with a certain conception of what's most important to them. But as they go through the 2-year program, that changes. And that's something that we, as an educational institution, very much cherish and value. So we should not think that that ends when a person, graduates and gets their final degree, but rather it's constantly ongoing. So one piece of it, Norman, is the values that a person holds dear will change over time. Second is the urgency and simply the facts on the ground change over time. So, there's an oft-told and very appropriate anecdote from the life of Winston Churchill, where someone was criticizing him for changing his opinion on an issue. And he said to that person, he said, well, when the facts change, I change my opinion. What do you do?
Leaders have this ongoing discussion within themselves that surface up from time to time. Who am I now? And who am I willing to be for my team, my values, and what I deem sacred? In the realm of sustainable finance, we recognize success as elements of profit, revenue, predictions of markets, and the like. But from this conversation, the leader will find greater profit internally through fulfillment, the desire to do good, and to spread that message of goodwill to those around us.
Environmental crisis is more advanced today than it was in the past. That's one. And also various issues of inequality that we face in the world are more exacerbated today than they may have been in the past. And for someone to say that they are now going to introduce this as a core value of their institution, let's say they say that, we want our company to be a catalyst for reducing inequalities, and that might be new to them. It's a wonderful thing to embrace because the world has become more unequal, and it may be now appropriate for that organization to embrace this as a value. So we should create the space for that and in fact celebrate it if that's what the leadership and stakeholders wish to do.
So, what role do leaders play in leading based on values? It's a heavy responsibility. If the leader chooses to proceed with social responsibility in mind, then it must come by example, and is reflected in the actions of the leader, as well as the well-being of the employees working within. Leading based on shared values, then, is a purpose, and leaders seek to pursue it. They find goodwill in leading, taking action from the values they believe in, both internally and within the organization, so that everybody benefits. As mentioned in the previous episode, sustainability and shared values, when applied in organizations, are felt by the public. They see it in the actions of these organizations, and they see how it benefits their community. The leader champions these changes, all for the better cause. In the next episode, you will hear all about systems thinking and how to view the world of Islamic finance from an ecosystem point of view. It's a riveting conversation, and I'm sure you will enjoy it. Until then, this is Norman Chella, and you have been listening to Exploring Sustainable Values on ASEAN Speaks by Maybank. See you in the next episode. Take care. Special thanks to Dr. Aamir for coming onto the show for a very captivating conversation. His experiences and involvement in a shared values-based organization is but one lens of many in understanding this exciting development. The contents in this episode are for educational purposes only and should not be taken as solicited advice. Maybank, as well as all parties mentioned in and connected with this episode, is not responsible for your use of the information contained in or linked from this episode. The contents showcase the personal opinions, experiences, and stories of contributors and do not reflect Maybank's stance on Islamic finance. Please seek an Islamic finance consultant for more detailed information to provide you an informed perspective in this space.